Hollywood in the autumn of 1984 was running on a specific kind of fuel that it had discovered worked extremely well at the box office, and that it intended to keep burning for as long as the audience kept showing up to watch it burn. The fuel was the action star, not the actor who happened to appear in action films. The specific category of man who had been identified by the studios as a physical event in himself, a man whose presence in a film communicated something to the audience before a single scene had been written or a single frame had been shot, the communication being that what was about to occur on screen was going to involve a level of physical authority that the audience could not produce in their own lives, and that the screen was therefore uniquely positioned to provide. The studios had discovered that this communication was worth a considerable amount of money if the right man was delivering it, and had spent the better part of the previous decade identifying the right men and building the machinery around them that converted their specific qualities into the reliable commercial product that the discovery had made possible. Snorts. By the autumn of 1984, the machinery had produced two names that sat at the top of the category with enough separation from the names below them that the industry had effectively organized itself around the question of which of the two was the defining name and which was the secondary one. The question had not been formally posed. It did not need to be formally posed, because the industry answered it informally every day through the specific mechanisms of deal sizes and opening weekend tracking numbers, and the particular attention that trade publications gave to one man's projects versus the others, and the specific way that producers talked about each of them when the other was not in the room. The two names were Arnold Schwarzenegger and Chuck Norris, and neither of them was under any illusion about the question or about the fact that the other man had an opinion about its answer that differed from his own. Clears throat. Arnold Schwarzenegger was 37 years old in the autumn of 1984. The Terminator had been released 3 weeks earlier and was doing the kind of business at the box office that changes the specific gravity of a man's position in an industry. The kind of business that causes the industry to reorganize itself around the new fact of what the business means for the man who produced it. He had arrived at that position from a direction that the action cinema had not previously navigated, which was the direction of competitive bodybuilding, of the Mr. Olympia title won 7 times, of a body developed to a standard of physical perfection that the camera responded to as though it had been waiting for exactly this subject matter, and had been underemployed in its absence. He was 6'2" and 235 pounds of the most photographed physique in the history of professional bodybuilding, and he carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had been the most physically impressive person in every room he had entered for the previous 15 years, and who had organized his approach to every room accordingly. The confidence was not performance. It was the genuine article, built through the specific process of competitive bodybuilding, which requires a man to develop an intimate and detailed knowledge of his own physical capability and to test that knowledge against other men who have developed the same intimate and detailed knowledge of theirs, and to do this repeatedly across 15 years of competition until the knowledge is no longer something he carries, but something he is. Snorts. Chuck was 44 years old. Missing in Action had been released earlier that year and had outperformed its studio's expectations in the specific way that Chuck Norris films had been outperforming their studio's expectations since the late 1970s, which was by finding the audience that the marketing had identified, and then finding additional audience that the marketing had not identified, and producing a total that made the next film easier to greenlight, and the one after that easier still. He had spent 26 years in the practice of Tang Soo Do, and had spent 15 of those years competing at the highest available level of the American karate circuit, and had spent the remaining 11 developing the film career that had made his name the reference point for a specific kind of action cinema that the audience associated with genuine physical credibility rather than with spectacular physical presentation. The distinction between credibility and presentation was a distinction that Chuck made and that Arnold did not make in the same way, and that the industry mostly declined to make at all because the industry's interest was in the result rather than in the process that produced the result, and the result in both cases was a man whose physical presence on screen communicated the specific message that the action genre required. But the distinction existed, and both men knew it existed. And the knowing of it was the specific piece of knowledge that sat underneath the professional atmosphere between them and gave the atmosphere its particular charge. They had been in the same rooms on several occasions before the evening in question. Industry events, award ceremonies. The specific gatherings that the Los Angeles entertainment world produces regularly enough that the people who occupy the same tier of it encounter each other with a frequency that is too high for genuine unfamiliarity, but too low and too structured for genuine knowledge to develop. They had been professionally courteous with each other in the way that men are professionally courteous when the professional courtesy is the surface of something that the professional context does not permit to be expressed as anything other than professional courtesy. The surface had held across every previous encounter, because the previous encounters had been structured enough that the surface was the only available register, and both men were experienced enough with structured encounters to remain within the register the structure required. Clear's throat. The evening in question was not a structured encounter. It was a private gathering at a house in Bel Air owned by a producer named Gerald Whitman, who had worked with both men on separate projects and who hosted these evenings 4 or 5 times a year with the specific philosophy of a man who believed that the most productive conversations in the film industry happened in private, and that private conversations required private settings, and that private settings required the kind of hospitality that made people comfortable enough to say what they actually thought, rather than what the structured environment required them to say. Whitman was good at hospitality. His evenings were known in the industry for the specific quality of genuine conversation that they produced, the quality of a room where the professional performance has been suspended by design, and what remains is the actual opinions and actual characters of the people in it. 22 people were present that evening. A mix of directors and producers and 2 studio executives, and several actors and the specific handful of people who occupy the edges of the film industry in the role of the genuinely informed outsiders who understand it well enough to have interesting things to say about it without being sufficiently inside it to have developed the institutional loyalty that prevents interesting things from being said. Snorts. Chuck arrived at 7:30. He arrived in the plain, unhurried way he arrived everywhere, alone. In a car he drove himself, wearing dark slacks and a plain shirt and the sport coat he wore to events that required a sport coat. He shook hands with Whitman at the door. He said hello to the people he knew. He found a position near the window that looked out over the Bel Air Canyon and stood there with a glass of water and the open, patient attention he brought to any room he was in that did not yet require anything specific from him, which was the attention of a man who was genuinely present rather than waiting for his turn to be the focus of the room. Arnold arrived 40 minutes later with the specific quality of arrival that a man develops when he has spent 15 years being the most physically impressive person in every room he enters, and has organized his entries accordingly. He was wearing a dark suit that had been constructed to accommodate a body that standard suit construction does not easily accommodate, and he moved through Whitman's living room with the rolling, expansive quality of a man who takes up the space he takes up without apology and without self-consciousness, because the space has always been available to him, and he has no reason to expect it to stop being available. Clear's throat. He greeted Whitman. He moved through the room. He saw Chuck at the window and moved toward him with the directness of a man who has identified the specific person in the room he wants to talk to, and is going there without the social detour that less direct men take through the other available conversations. They shook hands. They talked for the first 20 minutes in the way that 2 men talk when both of them are capable of genuine conversation, and both of them are in a room that has been designed to produce it. They talked about the industry and where it was going, and the specific question of what the audience wanted from the action genre, and whether what the audience wanted was the same thing that the best films in the genre had been providing, or whether the success had separated what the audience wanted from what the genre was capable of providing at its best. These were genuinely interesting questions, and both men had genuinely interesting things to say about them, and the conversation had the quality that conversations between intelligent people about things they know from the inside tend to have, which is the quality of producing in both participants, something they did not have before the conversation began. Snorts. Then the conversation shifted. The shift was produced by a question that one of the studio executives, a man named Horowitz, who had been standing near the window for the previous 15 minutes, and had been listening to the conversation with the attentiveness of a man who is gathering information he considers professionally useful, introduced into the exchange in the specific way that people introduce questions into exchanges when they want to observe the response rather than participate in it. He asked both men what they thought about the direction the action genre was taking with respect to the physical standard it was establishing for its leading men, specifically whether the standard was moving toward the aesthetic end of the spectrum or the functional end. It was the kind of question that sounded like an industry question, but that both men understood immediately was not an industry question. It was the question that had been sitting underneath the professional atmosphere between them for the better part of 3 years, suddenly present in the room in a form that the room's design and the evening's register made it impossible to treat as anything other than what it was. Clear's throat. Arnold answered first. He answered with the specific fluency of a man who had been thinking about the answer to this question for long enough that the answer was available without deliberation. He said that the action genre had evolved to a point where the physical standard it required was a standard of total physical development, of the kind of comprehensive capability that only the most rigorous training across multiple disciplines produced, and that the men who represented that standard most completely were the men who had developed their bodies to the fullest available expression of what human physical development could achieve. He said this with the confidence of a man describing something he embodied and knew he embodied, and who understood that the description was simultaneously a claim about himself and an assessment of the category. He said it in the direction of the room, rather than in the direction of Chuck, specifically. The direction of the room was a rhetorical choice. The studio executive near the window understood the choice. The other people who had drifted toward the window conversation in the previous 5 minutes understood the choice. Chuck understood the choice. Snorts. He said one thing in response. He said that total physical development was one standard, and that it was a legitimate and impressive standard, and that the men who had achieved it deserved the recognition the achievement warranted. He said this directly and without the diplomatic softening that makes an acknowledgement sound like a concession. Then he said that there was a different standard, and that the different standard was the standard of what a man could actually do when the situation required him to do it, without the controlled conditions that training environments and competition circuits and film sets provided. And that the men who had developed against that standard had developed something that the aesthetic standard, however impressive, did not produce and could not produce because the two standards were built through different processes toward different ends, and the ends were not interchangeable regardless of how impressive either end was when it was fully achieved. He said this in the same calm, even tone he used for everything, without emphasis and without the rhetorical architecture that men sometimes build around statements they want to land with particular force. He did not need the architecture. The statement was sufficient. Arnold looked at him. The room had gone quiet in the specific way that Whitman's living room went quiet on the occasions when the conversation had arrived at the thing it had actually been moving toward, rather than the thing the surface of the conversation had appeared to be moving toward. Horowitz was still near the window. He was not contributing anything to the exchange. He was watching it with the expression of a man who has introduced a question into a room and is now observing the consequences of the introduction with more interest than he had anticipated when he asked the question. Clear's throat. Arnold said that functional standards were interesting as far as they went. He said it with the specific quality of a man who is offering a concession that is also a diminishment, the concession being the acknowledgement that the standard exists, and the diminishment being the suggestion that where it goes is not far enough to constitute a complete standard by itself. He said that the question of what a man could do in a genuine situation was a theoretical question for most men in most situations, and that theoretical questions were answered by the preparation a man had made rather than by the testing that most men never encountered. He said that the preparation he had made across 15 years of competitive bodybuilding and the additional years of preparation for the specific physical demands of the films he had made constituted a standard of total readiness, that the functional category, whatever its legitimate merits, was a subset of, rather than an alternative to. He said all of this with the fluency and the confidence of a man who had been building this argument in his own mind for long enough that the building was complete and the argument was ready. Then he looked at Chuck with the specific directness of a man who has decided that the room is the right room and the moment is the right moment, and that what he has been not quite saying in every professional context he has shared with this man for 3 years is going to be said now. He said that Chuck's moment in the genre had been legitimate, and that the work had been real, and that the audience had responded to it in the way the audience responds to work that is real. He said all of this as the preamble it was. Then he said that the genre had moved past the moment Chuck represented, and that the audience had moved with it, and that the standard the genre now required was a standard that a different kind of preparation produced. He paused. He said it directly. He said that Chuck was finished in the genre. Snorts. The room was completely quiet. Not the working quiet of a conversation between pauses. The specific absolute quiet of 22 people who have just heard something said in a private room that the structured environment of the public world would never have permitted to be said, and who are in the process of determining what the saying of it requires of the room. Whitman was standing near the drinks table. He had the expression of a host who has designed a room for genuine conversation and has just discovered that genuine conversation has a range that his design had not fully accounted for. The two studio executives were not looking at each other. The directors, who had drifted toward the window conversation, were not looking at anyone in particular. Horowitz was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who had asked a question and has received an answer that exceeded his estimate of the available answers. Clear's throat, Chuck had not moved. He was standing in the same position he had been standing in since Arnold walked over, with the same quality of open, settled attention that he brought to every room that required him to pay attention to something. His expression had not changed in any visible way. The people in the room watching him watched him the way people watch a man when something significant has been said to him, and they are waiting to see what the saying produces. What it produced was a pause of approximately 4 seconds during which Chuck looked at Arnold with the open, patient expression that the people who knew him well recognized as the expression of a man who has heard something and has completed the hearing and is now deciding what the hearing requires. Then he said one thing. He said it in the same calm, even tone he had used for everything he had said that evening, which was the tone of a man making an observation rather than a declaration. The tone of a man who does not need the room to amplify what he is saying, because what he is saying is sufficient without amplification. He said that finished was a word that required a standard, and that the standard required a test, and that if Arnold was interested in conducting the test, he was prepared to make the test available. He said it in 7 words. He said it, and then he was quiet. Snorts. 7 seconds of silence followed. The people who were in Whitman's living room that evening described the silence in their various accounts using different words that all pointed at the same quality, which was the quality of a silence that is not the absence of something, but the presence of something that the room does not have the language for. It was the silence of 22 people simultaneously processing the specific weight of a 7-word response to a statement that had required considerably more than 7 words to make, and the processing was producing in all of them the same conclusion, which was that the 7 words had done something to the balance of the room that the preceding statement's many more words had not managed to undo. Clear's throat, Arnold looked at Chuck for the duration of the 7 seconds. The look was the look of a man who has said something significant and has received a response that is more significant than the something, and who is in the process of determining what the response requires of him. The determination took the 7 seconds. What it produced at the end of the 7 seconds was not what some of the people in the room had expected it to produce, which was an escalation, a continuation of the exchange along the trajectory the previous exchange had established. What it produced was something more interesting. Arnold said that he appreciated the directness. He said it in a tone that was different from the tone he had been using, the rhetorical fluent tone of a man delivering a prepared position. This tone was the tone of a man who has encountered something that his preparation did not account for and who is responding to the encounter rather than to the preparation. He said that the directness was something he respected. He said it, and he meant it in the specific way that exceptional men mean things when they encounter other exceptional men, whose exceptionalism operates in a domain different enough from their own that the encounter produces in them something that the men in the same domain do not produce, which is the genuine recognition of a kind of capability that they do not possess, and that the possession of which they cannot entirely dismiss as irrelevant to the question they were discussing. Snorts. Chuck nodded once. He said that he appreciated the conversation. He said it in the same tone. Then he turned back to the window and the Bel Air Canyon, and the glass of water that he had been holding since before Arnold walked over, and had continued to hold throughout the exchange with the specific quality of a man who does not put down what he was holding simply because something has required his attention. Because putting it down would suggest that what requires his attention is more significant than it is, and what had required his attention was not more significant than a glass of water held at a window in Bel Air on a private evening. It was simply something that had required his attention. He had given it the attention it required. He had returned to the window, Clear's throat. Horowitz left the window area first. He went to get a drink and did not come back to the window for the remainder of the evening. The 2 directors drifted back into other conversations with the specific gradual movement of men who are giving the principals the space to resume their own conversation at whatever pace the principals choose, rather than being directed back into it by the continued presence of an audience. Whitman circulated as hosts circulate, which is with the organized attentiveness of a man whose primary responsibility is the room rather than any specific exchange within it. Arnold remained near the window for a few minutes longer. He and Chuck talked about 1 or 2 things that were not the thing they had been talking about, in the way that men talk about things that are not the thing when they have finished with the thing, and neither of them requires the finished thing to be revisited or extended. Then Arnold moved toward another group in the room and the conversation at the window ended. Schnortz, Chuck stayed at the window for another 20 minutes. He finished the water. He talked with a director named Callan who had come over after the exchange with Arnold, and who wanted to discuss a project that Callan had been developing and that he believed was the right kind of material for Chuck at this specific moment in the genre's development. They talked about the project for 15 minutes with the genuine engagement of two professionals who are discussing something they both consider worth discussing. Then Chuck told Callan he would think about it. He said goodnight to Whitman. He shook hands with the people near the door. He walked out to the car he had driven himself and drove back across the canyon toward the valley. The people who were at Whitman's that evening told the story in the specific way that people tell stories about things they witnessed in private rooms, when the things were significant enough to require telling, but the private context requires a specific kind of care about how they travel. They told it to people they trusted. They told it in low voices, and without the embellishment that public retellings tend to accumulate, because the room itself had been the kind of room where embellishment would have been visible as embellishment, and the people who had been in it had developed accordingly a standard for telling the story that the room had set. What they told was this: Arnold Schwarzenegger had said that Chuck Norris was finished. He had said it with the full rhetorical preparation of a man who had been building the statement for 3 years. Chuck Norris had responded in 7 words. The 7 words had produced 7 seconds of silence in a room of 22 people. The silence had been the room's answer to the question of which of the 2 statements was the more complete one. Clear's Throat, Conan the Destroyer, was released in the summer of 1984. Missing in Action had been released in the spring. Code of Silence followed in 1985. Missing in Action 2 followed that same year. The Terminator franchise continued building toward the commercial peak it would reach in 1991. Both men continued working. Both men continued representing the specific quality of physical authority on screen that the genre required and that the audience continued showing up to watch. The question that the industry had been organized around before the evening in Bel Air continued after it, in the same form, because the industry's questions do not get resolved in private rooms in Bel Air over glasses of water. They get resolved by the box office, and the box office resolves them slowly and incompletely, and with a regularity that ensures the question is never fully answered. Because the answer would end the question, and the question is more commercially useful than any answer. Snorts, what the evening in Bel Air resolved was something different from the industry question. It resolved the private question between the 2 men, the question that had been sitting underneath the professional atmosphere for 3 years and that had arrived in Whitman's living room in the specific form of a statement about finishing. The resolution was not a verdict. It was not a declaration of one man's superiority over the other. It was the specific, quieter thing that resolutions between exceptional men tend to be, which is the mutual acknowledgement that the other man is what he is, and that what he is sufficient to make the question genuinely interesting rather than answerable through the application of any single available standard. The 7 words had done that. They had done it with the economy that Chuck Norris brought to everything, the economy of a man who does not use more than the situation requires, because the situation reveals through its requirements exactly how much is needed, and what was needed in Whitman's living room on that autumn evening in 1984 was 7 words and 7 seconds of silence and the return to a glass of water at a window looking out over the Bel Air Canyon. Clear's Throat. That was what finished looked like from the inside of the word. That was what the man who had been described by it had to say about the description. 7 words. Then the window, then the water, then the canyon in the dark outside the glass, indifferent and complete, the way the best answers are always indifferent and complete, which is without any particular interest in whether the room appreciated them, because the room had already done the appreciating, and the appreciating had already produced its 7 seconds, and the 7 seconds had already said everything that needed saying before anyone in the room had found the words to say it.